My childhood friend kept insisting my wife married the wrong guy. He had a meltdown when she told everyone what he'd really been doing. Garrett screamed obscenities at my wife in front of 73 people at the hospital fundraiser gala. His tuxedo jacket hung off one shoulder, exposing his sweat-stained dress shirt. Security guards flanked him on both sides, but he kept lunging toward Natalie, who stood perfectly still on the small stage, her hand resting on the podium like she'd just delivered a speech about quarterly donations instead of systematically destroying my oldest friend's entire life. The microphone had already been cut, but her words still echoed through the ballroom. She'd spoken for 6 minutes and 42 seconds. I'd counted, my hands gripping the table edge so hard my knuckles went white. 6 minutes to detail everything Garrett had been doing for the past 3 years. Every manipulation, every lie, every calculated move designed to end my marriage. The champagne flute next to my plate sat untouched. I'd ordered it before Natalie's speech, back when I thought tonight was just another insufferable charity event where I'd smile through rubber chicken and forced networking. Now the bubbles had gone flat, and my entire understanding of reality had shattered along with Garrett's composure as security dragged him toward the exit. He fought them every step, his dress shoes sliding across the polished marble floor. I met Garrett Montgomery in 2nd grade, when his family moved into the house 3 doors down from mine on Sycamore Avenue. We bonded over G.I. Joe action figures and a shared hatred of lima beans in the school cafeteria. By 4th grade, we'd built an elaborate fort in the woods behind my house using scrap lumber stolen from his dad's construction site. We carved our initials into the main support beam, with a pocket knife Garrett shoplifted from the hardware store. That should have been my first warning. The theft didn't bother him. He bragged about it, describing in detail how he'd distracted the cashier while slipping the knife into his jacket pocket. Even at 10 years old, Garrett understood manipulation as a skill set rather than a moral failure. We spent summers riding bikes through the neighborhood until streetlights came on, winters building snow forts and pelting cars with snowballs from behind parked vehicles. His mom worked double shifts as a nurse at Presbyterian Hospital, leaving Garrett unsupervised most afternoons. My house became his second home. My mom fed him dinner at least 4 nights a week, never commenting on the frequency of his visits or the way he'd eat like he hadn't seen food in days. Middle school changed nothing between us. We navigated the brutal social hierarchy of 8th grade together, defending each other from bullies and sharing homework answers. Garrett dated my sister briefly during freshman year, a 3-week relationship that ended when she discovered he'd been reading her diary entries she'd foolishly left in her backpack. He claimed he was just worried about her, checking to make sure she wasn't depressed or cutting herself. My sister called him a controlling psycho and refused to speak to him for months. I defended Garrett then, arguing that he'd overstepped boundaries but meant well. Looking back now, I can see the pattern that I spent decades ignoring. Garrett collected information about people the way other kids collected baseball cards, storing away secrets and vulnerabilities for future use. His interest in my sister's private thoughts wasn't concern. It was reconnaissance. By senior year, Garrett and I had been accepted to the same state university. We'd planned it deliberately, coordinating our applications to ensure we'd remain together. His mom cried when the acceptance letters arrived, grateful that someone would look after her son at college. My parents seemed relieved too, as if Garrett's presence would keep me grounded and focused on academics rather than parties. College expanded our friendship in ways I didn't recognize as unhealthy until much later. Garrett monitored my schedule, knowing my class times, work shifts, study groups. He'd show up unannounced at the library when I said I'd be studying alone, claiming he just happened to be there. He introduced me to girls he deemed appropriate, then systematically destroyed those relationships by revealing carefully timed information. Jenny from our psychology class dumped me after Garrett showed her text messages where I'd complained about her constant need for reassurance. I'd vented to him privately, never imagining he'd screenshot and share those conversations. When I confronted him, Garrett insisted he'd been trying to help. Jenny was toxic, he explained. She was dragging down my GPA with constant emotional demands. Better to end it now before I wasted more time. I believed him. We shared an apartment junior year, a cramped 2-bedroom off-campus with perpetually broken air conditioning and a landlord who ignored maintenance requests. Garrett controlled the thermostat, the grocery shopping, the social calendar. When I suggested inviting other friends over for game nights, he'd find reasons why each person was problematic. Too loud, too messy, too unreliable. Eventually, I stopped suggesting it. Our social circle shrank to just us, exactly as Garrett preferred. I met Natalie during senior year in a crowded coffee shop near campus. She'd grabbed the last available table, and I asked if I could share the space while I worked on my thesis. She looked up from her laptop, pushing her dark hair behind her ear, and smiled. That smile rearranged something fundamental in my chest. We talked for 3 hours, my thesis forgotten, her marketing presentation abandoned. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, traveling throughout the region, based out of her apartment downtown. She was 26 to my 22, confident and self-assured in ways that made my college experiences feel juvenile. When I mentioned her to Garrett that evening, his expression darkened. He asked pointed questions about her age, her job, her intentions. Why would an older woman be interested in a college senior? What did she want from me? Was I sure she wasn't using me for something? I dismissed his concerns as overprotectiveness. Garrett met Natalie 2 weeks later when she picked me up from our apartment for dinner. He was polite, but cold, answering her friendly questions with monosyllables. After she left, he spent an hour listing red flags he'd observed. Her body language seemed calculated. Her compliments felt manipulative. Had I noticed how she touched my arm constantly, love-bombing me to lower my defenses? I told him he was being paranoid, but his words planted seeds of doubt that took root in quiet moments. Our relationship progressed, despite Garrett's escalating warnings. Natalie and I fell into an easy rhythm of dinners, weekend trips, long phone calls when her work took her out of town. She never pressured me about my friendship with Garrett, but I could sense her discomfort when I explained our living situation and history. 3 months into dating, she asked directly why Garrett seemed to hate her. I defended him reflexively, explaining his protective nature and our long friendship. Natalie didn't push back. She simply nodded and changed the subject, but I caught her watching Garrett carefully whenever they were in the same room, like she was studying a dangerous animal at the zoo. Garrett began documenting Natalie's perceived flaws in a spiral notebook he left open on the kitchen counter. I discovered it accidentally one morning while making coffee. Page after page of observations, times, dates. N arrived 12 minutes late for dinner, showing disrespect for his time. N contradicted herself about her college major, first saying marketing, then business administration. Possible liar. N's ex-boyfriend called her phone while she was in the bathroom. She's definitely still involved with him. The detail was obsessive, disturbing. When I confronted Garrett, he defended the notebook as evidence gathering. He was protecting me from an obvious manipulator, documenting the truth so I couldn't later claim he'd never warned me. He seemed genuinely hurt that I viewed his surveillance as inappropriate, rather than caring. After graduation, I accepted a job at an accounting firm downtown. The salary meant I could finally afford my own apartment, a studio on the west side with actual central heating and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests. I told Garrett about my plans to move out over dinner at our usual pizza place, bracing for his reaction. He went silent, staring at his plate for a full minute before responding. His voice was measured, controlled. He reminded me of every time he'd helped me, every loan he'd covered, every crisis he'd managed. Moving out felt like betrayal, abandonment of someone who'd been there since 2nd grade. I assured him our friendship wouldn't change, just our living situation. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He asked if Natalie had pressured me into this decision. When I said no, he nodded slowly, clearly not believing me. The move-out process took 3 weeks. Garrett was never home during the packing, claiming work obligations, leaving me to box up my belongings alone. He didn't help load the U-Haul or visit my new place afterward. For 2 months, he didn't return my calls or respond to texts. I felt guilty, like I'd abandoned him, even though intellectually I knew moving out at 23 was normal. Natalie celebrated my independence, but she never said I told you so about Garrett's reaction, which I appreciated more than I could articulate at the time. Garrett reappeared suddenly, showing up at my office building one afternoon with lunch from my favorite deli. He apologized for his behavior, admitting he'd overreacted to the change. He'd been in therapy, working through abandonment issues stemming from his childhood. His mom had left him alone so often he'd developed unhealthy attachment patterns. He was working on it, genuinely trying to be a better friend. I accepted his apology, relieved to have my best friend back. We fell into a new rhythm, meeting for lunch weekly, attending sports events together. He even made an effort with Natalie, inviting both of us to dinners and concerts. She remained guarded around him, but appreciated his apparent growth. I proposed to Natalie 11 months after moving into my apartment. We'd been dating for nearly 2 years, and I couldn't imagine my future without her. She said yes immediately, laughing and crying simultaneously. We celebrated with champagne in my cramped studio, making plans for a small wedding in her hometown. When I told Garrett, expecting congratulations, his face went blank. He asked if I was sure, if we'd been together long enough, if I really knew Natalie well enough to make this commitment. When I insisted I was certain, he nodded mechanically and left early, claiming a headache. That night, he sent a 3,800-word email detailing every reason the marriage would fail. He'd researched Natalie's employment history, finding gaps he claimed were suspicious. He'd driven past her apartment at odd hours, documenting cars that visited regularly. He'd created a spreadsheet of her behavior patterns, highlighting inconsistencies. The email ended with a plea. Don't do this. You're making a mistake you can't undo. She's hiding something. I know it. Please trust me. I showed the email to Natalie, who read it without expression. When she finished, she asked me what I wanted to do. Did I believe Garrett? Did I want to postpone the wedding? I told her no. Garrett was crossing lines, letting his own issues poison our relationship. She hugged me tightly, and I felt her body tremble slightly. She said she understood he was my oldest friend, but his behavior was escalating into something dangerous. She asked if I'd consider limiting contact with him until after the wedding, just to reduce stress during planning. I agreed reluctantly, knowing it would trigger another cycle of guilt and manipulation from Garrett. I called him the next day to explain the boundaries. He didn't argue or get angry. His voice was eerily calm. He said he understood, that he'd respect my decision. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. When this falls apart, and it will, I'll be here. I'll always be here. That's what real friendship means. The wedding happened 6 months later, despite Garrett's prediction. Small ceremony, 50 guests, perfect weather. Garrett attended because not inviting him felt like a larger statement than I was ready to make. He sat in the back row, dressed impeccably, smiling at appropriate moments. He didn't object during the ceremony or cause a scene. At the reception, he gave a toast that praised our long friendship while barely mentioning Natalie. People laughed at his childhood stories, unaware of the subtext I heard in every carefully chosen word. He's always needed someone to look after him, Garrett said, gesturing toward me with his champagne glass. I hope Natalie understands what she's signing up for. The room took it as affectionate ribbing. I saw Natalie's jaw tighten. The first year of marriage was everything I'd hoped for. Natalie and I bought a small house in the suburbs with a mortgage that terrified me and a yard that needed constant work. We adopted a rescue dog named Captain who barked at squirrels and slept between us every night. I got promoted to senior accountant. Natalie landed a regional manager position that reduced her travel significantly. We fell into domestic routines that felt revolutionary in their mundane comfort. Grocery shopping together, fighting about whose turn it was to empty the dishwasher. Weekend mornings in bed with coffee and crossword puzzles. Garrett remained peripherally present, texting occasionally, meeting for lunch every few months. The frequency had decreased, and I felt relieved. Maybe he'd finally accepted reality. Maybe therapy was actually helping. Natalie never forbid me from seeing him, but she'd developed a policy of staying home when Garrett and I made plans. She'd kiss me goodbye and tell me to have fun. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she'd watch from the window until my car pulled away. During one of our lunches, 8 months after the wedding, Garrett asked how married life was treating me. I responded enthusiastically, describing our new house and Natalie's promotion. He nodded along, smiling, asking follow-up questions that seemed genuine. Then, as we were paying the check, he mentioned he'd been doing some research on marriage statistics. Did I know that pharmaceutical sales had one of the highest infidelity rates among professions? All that travel, hotel rooms, expense account dinners with doctors. He was just sharing information, something to be aware of, not an accusation. I told him to stop, that his concern was transparent and unwelcome. He raised his hands in surrender, apologizing. He was just looking out for me, like always. Old habits. Strange things began happening around month 10 of marriage. Small incidents that felt disconnected until the pattern emerged later. A co-worker mentioned seeing Natalie at a restaurant across town with a man who wasn't me, deep in conversation. When I asked her about it, she had no memory of it, no reason to be in that neighborhood that day. Her calendar showed meetings in completely different parts of the city. I dismissed it as mistaken identity. My boss received an anonymous email claiming I was using company resources for personal business, providing specific examples that were entirely fabricated. The investigation cleared me, but damaged relationships with management that I'd spent years building. The sender used an untraceable email address. Our neighbors stopped us during an evening walk to ask if everything was okay, mentioning they'd heard loud arguments from our house multiple times that week. Natalie and I stared at each other, confused. We'd barely been home that week due to work obligations, and when we were there, we'd watched television quietly before bed. No arguments, no raised voices. The neighbor seemed embarrassed, apologizing for misunderstanding what they'd heard, but doubt lingered in their expression. Natalie's sister called, upset, saying Natalie had missed their mother's birthday dinner without explanation, leaving the family worried and hurt. Natalie showed me her calendar with the dinner clearly marked, her card purchased weeks earlier. She'd sent her sister multiple texts that day, confirming attendance. Her sister had no record of those texts. They'd simply vanished from her phone. We couldn't explain it. Technology glitches. Coincidence. The incidents escalated in frequency and strangeness. I received a certified letter from a law firm I'd never contacted, following up on a consultation about divorce proceedings I'd never scheduled. The letter referenced a phone call from my number on a specific date and time when I'd been in a meeting with 20 other people. Natalie found a receipt in my car for a jewelry purchase from a store I'd never visited, dated the previous week. The receipt showed a women's bracelet. Expensive. Definitely not the style Natalie wore. When I called the store, they confirmed the purchase had been made with a credit card in my name, but security footage showed someone who wasn't me making the transaction. They filed a fraud report, but couldn't explain how the physical receipt ended up in my vehicle. Our marriage counselor called to reschedule our appointment, mentioning that the session had been difficult and she wanted to give us more time to process. We'd never been to marriage counseling, never contacted a therapist. The counselor had detailed notes about our visit, including descriptions of our clothing, our voices, our specific complaints about each other. None of it was real, but it existed in some official record. Someone was systematically constructing a false narrative of our relationship deteriorating, creating evidence of problems that didn't exist, framing both of us as people we weren't. Natalie started keeping a log of every incident, dates and times, witnesses when available. She approached it methodically, her sales training kicking in. If someone was building a case against our marriage, we needed documentation of the truth. I felt paranoid writing things down, Like we were conspiracy theorists seeing connections where random chance existed. But the pattern was undeniable. Someone knew our schedules. Someone had access to our information. Someone wanted us to fail. Natalie came home from work one afternoon pale and shaking. She'd received a call from her boss, asking about complaints filed by several doctors on her sales route. The complaints alleged inappropriate behavior, aggressive sales tactics, showing up at their homes instead of offices. Her boss showed her the complaint forms, all filed within a 2-week period, all describing encounters that never happened. Natalie had email records, GPS data from her car, calendar evidence showing she'd been nowhere near these doctors on the dates listed. Her company launched an investigation, placing her on administrative leave while they sorted through the conflicting information. The timing was surgical, precise. The complaints arrived just before her annual review, right when she was being considered for another promotion. If proven true, they'd destroy her career. If proven false, they'd still damage her professional reputation, creating doubt that would follow her for years. We sat at our kitchen table that night, surrounded by printed emails and calendar screenshots, trying to make sense of targeted harassment that felt personal and calculated. Who hated us enough to dedicate this much time and effort to destroying our lives? What did they gain from our misery? I suggested hiring a private investigator, but Natalie pointed out we couldn't afford it with her on leave and our mortgage demanding its monthly sacrifice. Instead, we started investigating ourselves, becoming amateur detectives in our own lives. We changed our passwords, checked our accounts for unauthorized access, installed security cameras around our house. The cameras revealed nothing useful, just ordinary suburban activity, neighbors walking dogs, mail delivery, the occasional squirrel investigating our trash cans. Until one night, when the motion sensor activated at 2:37 in the morning. The footage showed Garrett standing in our driveway, looking directly at our bedroom window. He stood there for 11 minutes before walking away. I confronted Garrett the next day at his apartment, a renovated loft downtown that his mother's life insurance had helped purchase. He seemed surprised by my anger, inviting me in with confusion rather than defensiveness. When I played the security footage on my phone, he watched without emotion. Then he explained. He'd been driving home from a late work event, passing through our neighborhood, when he noticed our porch light was burned out. He'd stopped to check if we were okay, if anything looked wrong. He was worried about us, especially with all the stress we'd been under lately. Standing in the driveway at nearly 3 in the morning, staring at our bedroom, was just concern? His explanation made no sense, but he delivered it with such conviction that I almost doubted my own interpretation of the footage. He reminded me he'd known me since I was 7 years old. Every terrible thing that happened to us felt like it happened to him, too. He'd always been the one who worried, who looked out for me, who saw dangers before they materialized. If that made him seem obsessive, well, maybe obsessive friendship was better than the alternative. Most people didn't have anyone who cared that much. I left his apartment more confused than angry, his words echoing in my head. Natalie watched me return home, reading my expression. She asked what he'd said. When I told her, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that shifted my entire perspective. He doesn't love you. He owns you. There's a difference. That night, she showed me research she'd been conducting. Erotomania, obsessive love disorder, limerence, clinical terms for what Garrett exhibited, the belief that another person was destined to be with him, that their connection transcended normal friendship, the stalking, the interference, the inability to accept rejection. It wasn't about my happiness. It was about his need for control, for possession. She'd been documenting not just the harassment of our marriage, but Garrett's behavior patterns going back years. Every girlfriend of mine that had suddenly ended, every friendship I'd lost, every job opportunity that mysteriously fell through right when Garrett expressed concerns. The pattern wasn't coincidence. It was systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his access to me. We filed a police report about the driveway incident, but the officer seemed unimpressed. Standing in someone's driveway wasn't illegal. Concerning, sure, but not criminal. We'd need more evidence of direct harassment, specific threats, something actionable. The security footage just showed someone standing in a public-ish space. Without proof of actual harm, there wasn't much they could do. Maybe file for a protective order if the behavior continued, but even that was a stretch based on current evidence. We were on our own. Natalie's company investigation cleared her of wrongdoing, finding no evidence supporting the doctor's complaints. In fact, several doctors claimed they'd never filed any complaints at all. Someone had submitted forms using their names and forged signatures. The company apologized, reinstated her fully, even gave her a bonus for the stress. But the episode had damaged her standing. Colleagues looked at her differently now. She'd been accused of something, and even though proven innocent, the stain remained. Her next promotion went to someone less qualified, someone whose name had never appeared in a HR investigation. The false complaints accomplished exactly what they were designed to do: destroy without leaving fingerprints. I started noticing Garrett everywhere. At the grocery store where we shopped, at the gas station I used weekly. Outside my office building during lunch, each sighting came with a plausible explanation. He'd moved near my office for work. The grocery store had better produce than his usual place. The gas station was on his way to his mother's house. but the coincidences piled up like snow in a blizzard, each flake individually innocent, collectively suffocating. He knew where we'd be and when. He was tracking us somehow. Natalie found the device 3 weeks later while changing a flat tire. A small GPS tracker magnetically attached to the inside of the wheel well, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Professional grade, not some cheap Amazon purchase. The kind private investigators used for surveillance. She left it attached, not wanting to alert Garrett that we'd discovered his method. Instead, we used it against him, feeding him false information by driving to places we didn't actually go, creating decoy movements while living our real lives elsewhere. The GPS showed us visiting marriage counselors we never consulted, lawyers we never hired, apartments we never toured, building a false narrative for Garrett to consume. Natalie's plan evolved slowly, methodically. She wouldn't just prove Garrett was harassing us. She'd prove the scope of his obsession, the years of manipulation, the systematic destruction of any relationship that threatened his control. She contacted every ex-girlfriend of mine she could track down through social media, 7 women, spanning from high school through college. She explained our situation, asked if they'd experienced anything unusual when we were dating. All 7 had stories. Garrett spreading rumors that destroyed their reputations. Garrett sharing private information I'd confided in him. Garrett creating situations that made me doubt the relationship. One girl, Rebecca from sophomore year, still had emails from Garrett sent months after we'd broken up. He'd been checking in, seeing how she was doing, subtly undermining any positive memories she had of our relationship, planting seeds of resentment and hurt that ensured she'd never consider reconnecting. The pattern was identical across all 7 relationships. Garrison would gather information, wait for the relationship to reach a vulnerable point, then deploy carefully timed revelations designed to trigger breakups. He never attacked me directly. Instead, he'd position himself as the neutral friend sharing difficult truths, forcing the girls to make the decision to leave. That way, I'd blame them for ending things, never suspecting his involvement. Natalie compiled testimony from all 7 women, creating a timeline of Garrett's interference in my relationship spanning 15 years. She contacted my former roommates, co-workers, even neighbors from my old apartment building. Each person had observations about Garrett's unusual behavior, his constant presence, his monitoring of my schedule. Separately, the incidents seemed like quirks of an overprotective friend. Together, they painted a portrait of obsessive stalking. She hired a forensic IT specialist using money borrowed from her sister. The specialist examined our computers, phones, accounts, looking for signs of unauthorized access. He found malware on both our laptops, sophisticated spyware that logged keystrokes, captured screenshots, accessed our cameras and microphones. The infection dated back 2 years, installed shortly after we'd gotten engaged. Every email we'd sent, every password we'd typed, every private conversation we'd had in our own home had been monitored. The specialist traced the malware to software Garrett had installed under the guise of helping when my laptop had frozen during a work project. He'd offered to fix it, taking the computer overnight, returning it working perfectly. That night, he'd installed spyware that gave him complete access to my digital life. He'd done the same thing to Natalie's laptop when she'd mentioned having virus problems during a rare dinner where all 3 of us were present. The specialist documented everything, creating a report that detailed not just the current surveillance, but historical data showing the exact files Garrett had accessed. He'd read every text message, every bank statement, every work email. He'd watched through our webcams, listened through our microphones. He knew when we were home, when we were intimate, when we fought. Our entire marriage had been performed for an audience of 1, and we hadn't known he was watching. The evidence was criminal, prosecutable. Illegal wiretapping, unauthorized computer access, stalking. But Natalie wanted more than criminal charges. She wanted public humiliation. She wanted everyone who'd ever believed Garrett's concerned friend act to see the truth. She wanted his social circle, his co-workers, his family, to understand the depth of his obsession and manipulation. She secured a speaking slot at the hospital fundraiser gala where Garrett served on the planning committee. The event attracted everyone in our social and professional circles. 200 people dressed in formal wear, eating overpriced food for charity, performing respectability and community concern. Natalie submitted her topic as Building Strong Communities Through Accountability and Truth. The planning committee approved it without much scrutiny, assuming generic inspirational content about supporting local healthcare. The night of the gala, I still didn't know the full extent of Natalie's plan. She'd been secretive, telling me to trust her, that tonight would end everything. I'd worn my best suit, helped her with her zipper, driven to the hotel ballroom where the event was being held. Garrett had been there early, greeting guests, playing the role of community leader. He'd shaken my hand, kissed Natalie's cheek, complimented her dress. His performance was flawless, charming, concerned, asking about my work and her health. The mask had never been more convincing. Dinner was served, speeches began. Board members talked about hospital expansion plans and donor impact. Everyone clapped politely, checking phones under tables, waiting for the event to end so they could leave with their charity tax deductions and social obligations satisfied. Then Natalie's name was called. She walked to the stage with printed documents in her hand, her expression calm. She began by thanking everyone for coming, for supporting the hospital, for being a community that cared about truth and justice. standard opening remarks that made people settle back in their chairs, bracing for boring inspiration. Then she said, "I'm here tonight to tell you about a man who has spent the past 15 years systematically destroying lives while wearing the mask of friendship. His name is Garrett Montgomery. He's sitting at table 7. Every head turned. Garrett sat frozen, his wine glass halfway to his mouth. She didn't pause. She described the GPS tracker, the spyware, the surveillance. She described the false accusations, the forged documents, the anonymous complaints. She described 7 past relationships destroyed through calculated manipulation. She described financial records she'd obtained, showing Garrett had paid the doctors who'd filed false complaints against her, finding the payment trail through his business accounts. He'd been sloppy, using his company credit card. She described emails between Garrett and various people in our lives, obtained through legal discovery for a restraining order hearing she'd filed without telling me. In those emails, Garrett had explicitly discussed strategies for ending my marriage. He'd recruited people, offering money, favors, whatever it took. Some people had refused. Others had participated. She named them, table by table. People squirmed in their seats. She described Garrett's apartment, which a friend of hers had toured under the pretense of interest in his tenant insurance recommendations Garrett sold on the side. The apartment contained an entire wall dedicated to me. Photos spanning from childhood to present, organized chronologically. Articles about my academic achievements. Copies of my tax returns, medical records, employment contracts. He'd been building a shrine, documenting my life in obsessive detail. She'd taken pictures of the wall during that tour, and now they appeared on the screen behind her, projected for everyone to see. 200 people gasped collectively. She described Garrett's search history, obtained through the forensic IT specialist's investigation. He'd researched how to break up marriages, how to gaslight someone, how to make someone appear mentally unstable. He'd visited forums for obsessive love disorder, not seeking help, but learning techniques. He'd studied me like a scientist studies specimens, looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. She described his journal, excerpts of which she read aloud, page after page of entries detailing his conviction that I belonged with him, not romantically, but as his permanent companion, his property. His project. He'd written about me in possessive terms that made people's faces twist with disgust. He needs me. Without me, he falls apart. I'm the only one who truly understands him. Natalie is a temporary obstacle. Every girlfriend has been temporary. They all leave eventually, but I'm forever. She described how Garrett had planned to escalate his campaign. The journal contained future plans, planting drugs in my car, creating evidence of infidelity, pushing Natalie toward a mental breakdown, whatever it took to prove I'd married wrong, that I needed rescue. He'd written detailed scenarios, costs, timelines. It wasn't just harassment, it was a multi-year campaign with defined objectives and measurable outcomes. Natalie described the law firm she'd consulted, how they'd helped her obtain restraining orders, file criminal complaints, build a case for prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming, documented, irrefutable. She wasn't making accusations. She was presenting facts. Then she turned and looked directly at Garrett. "You told me I married the wrong guy. You've spent years trying to prove it. But you know what you never understood? Love isn't ownership. Friendship isn't surveillance. Caring isn't control. You don't love him. You never did. You just can't stand that he chose someone over you." That's when Garrett stood up, screaming. Security had been warned, positioned strategically after Natalie had briefed them before the event. They moved quickly, but Garrett still managed to overturn his table, sending plates and glasses crashing. He lunged toward the stage, spitting words too garbled by rage to understand. The microphone had been cut, but everyone heard him screaming about betrayal, about lies, about ungrateful people who didn't appreciate real love. He sounded deranged, validating everything Natalie had just revealed. They dragged him through the ballroom while he fought them, his expensive tuxedo tearing, his carefully constructed image shredding with every wild movement. The ballroom erupted into chaos once he was removed. People crowded around me, asking questions, offering support, apologizing for believing Garrett's stories over the years. Some admitted they'd participated in his schemes, begging forgiveness, claiming they didn't understand the full picture. Others fled, embarrassed by association. Natalie returned to our table, her hands shaking now that adrenaline was fading. I held her, feeling her body tremble against mine. She'd done it. She'd exposed everything, protected us, destroyed Garrett's credibility completely. But the cost was visible in her eyes, the weight of going public with our most painful private experiences. The investigation moved quickly after that night. Police reviewed all the evidence Natalie had compiled. They arrested Garrett on multiple charges: illegal surveillance, wiretapping, stalking, fraud, conspiracy. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. He documented his own crimes in meticulous detail, never imagining anyone would access his journals and files. His lawyer tried to argue mental illness, obsessive disorder that required treatment rather than punishment. The judge wasn't sympathetic. Garrett had planned methodically, executed carefully, understood consequences. Mental illness might explain his motivations, but it didn't excuse his actions. He received 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years probation with strict no-contact orders. He'd lost his job, his apartment, his reputation. His mother visited him once, then never again, unable to reconcile the son she thought she knew with the evidence presented in court. My former co-workers came forward after Garrett's arrest, admitting he'd manipulated them too. The boss, who'd investigated me for misuse of company resources, had received an anonymous tip that seemed credible, backed by fabricated evidence. Once Garrett's pattern became public, everyone started reevaluating interactions they'd dismissed as innocent. How many people had he manipulated? How many lives had he damaged? The true scope might never be fully known. Natalie's company reinstated her promotion after understanding the full context of the false complaints. They offered counseling, support, public backing. Her boss personally apologized for not investigating more thoroughly initially, for putting her through unnecessary stress. But some damage couldn't be undone. Her relationship with colleagues had shifted. She was the woman with the psycho-stalker, the victim who'd had to publicly expose her trauma. She eventually transferred to a different region, finding a fresh start where her reputation preceded her. Our marriage survived, strengthened by crisis in ways wedding vows never predicted. We sold our house, moved to a different suburb where Garrett had never been. New cameras, new security, new locks on every door and window. Trust rebuilt slowly. Both of us traumatized by years of surveillance and manipulation. Therapy helped. So did time. The 7 ex-girlfriends Natalie had contacted formed an unexpected support group. They met quarterly, sharing their experiences, processing collective trauma. Some remained angry. Others had found peace. All of them credited Natalie with giving them context for relationships that had failed in ways they'd never understood. Rebecca told me during one meeting that she'd blamed herself for years, convinced she'd ruined something good. Learning about Garrett's interference freed her from guilt she'd carried since sophomore year. My relationship with friendship changed fundamentally. I'd trusted Garrett for 2 decades, never questioning his motives, never seeing the manipulation. How could I trust my judgment about anyone? Therapy addressed this, too. Garrett was an outlier, skilled in deception. Most people weren't predators disguised as friends. But I remained cautious, aware now of patterns I'd ignored before. People who isolated you from others. People who monitored your activities. People who couldn't accept your choices without making them about themselves. These were red flags I'd never noticed because they'd been normalized since childhood. Garrett sent letters from prison, rambling manifestos that violated his no-contact order. We forwarded them to his parole officer without reading them. Each violation added time to his sentence. He couldn't stop, even incarcerated, even with everything lost. The obsession remained, proving Natalie's point. It wasn't about me. It was about his need for control, his inability to accept reality that contradicted his desired narrative. The hospital gala became local legend, retold with variations and embellishments. The night Natalie destroyed someone's life with a charity speech. People debated whether she'd been cruel or justified, whether public humiliation served justice. I heard arguments on both sides at coffee shops and parties. Some thought she should have handled it privately. Others celebrated her courage to expose abuse publicly. Natalie didn't care about public opinion. She'd done what needed doing, and she slept well afterward. 3 years passed. Garrett's release date approached. My anxiety ramped up as the date neared. Would he come back? Would he try again? The restraining order would remain in effect, but paper didn't stop determined people. Natalie and I discussed moving out of state, starting completely fresh. Before we made that decision, we received a letter from Garrett's therapist at the prison facility. Garrett had requested permission to send a letter of apology, mediated through the therapist to avoid violating the no-contact order. We could refuse. We could read it and not respond. We could engage in a supervised communication if we wanted. We agreed to read the letter under our own therapist's supervision. The letter was different from his previous prison writings. Shorter, clearer, genuinely remorseful. He'd been in intensive therapy, finally confronting the obsessive patterns he'd denied for decades. He understood now what he'd done, the damage caused, the violation of trust. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. He was simply acknowledging truth and apologizing. He planned to move across the country after release, starting over somewhere I'd never visit. He'd signed over rights to any shared memories, any claim to friendship. I was free of him completely. We never responded. The letter sat in a folder with all the other documentation of those years, evidence of what we'd survived, proof that damage could be recognized and growth, however late, remained possible. Garrett moved to Oregon after his release. His social media showed a quiet life, therapy sessions, part-time work, no photos of friends, no mentions of relationships, just existence, smaller and isolated, exactly what he'd tried to prevent for me. Years later, during a work conference in Seattle, I saw Garrett across a hotel lobby. He looked older, grayer, diminished. Our eyes met for just a moment. He didn't approach or wave, just nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and goodbye, then turned and walked away. That final image replaced earlier memories. Not the friend from second grade or the manipulator from the gala, but simply someone who'd learned too late that you can't force people into the shapes you need them to fill. Natalie and I built the quiet life Garrett had tried to destroy. No drama, no surveillance, no one questioning our choices. We had a daughter who never knew the full story of the man who almost prevented her existence. Captain the dog died peacefully at 15, and we adopted 2 more rescues who barked at squirrels with equal enthusiasm. I changed careers, leaving accounting for nonprofit work that felt meaningful. Natalie wrote a book about surviving obsessive stalking, helping others recognize patterns before damage became irreparable. Our marriage wasn't perfect. We fought about ordinary things like every couple: whose turn to clean the gutters, whether we needed a new couch, what to watch on Netflix. But the fights were honest, unmanipulated. No third party pulling strings or creating false narratives, just 2 people choosing each other daily, making it work through actual effort rather than manufactured crisis. The ballroom speech became a turning point for conversations about male friendship and possessive behavior. Other victims came forward with similar stories, men and women who'd experienced friends who couldn't accept boundaries or autonomy. Support groups formed, resources developed. Natalie's speech, viral online within hours of the event, had sparked discussions that extended far beyond our personal experience. Sometimes I wonder what Garrett's life would have looked like if he'd gotten help earlier. If someone had recognized the obsessive patterns in childhood and intervened. If his mother's absence and his attachment issues had been addressed before they calcified into something destructive. But speculation changed nothing. He'd made choices for decades. Each manipulation was deliberate. Each violation was calculated. At some point, explanation becomes excuse, and accountability matters more than understanding root causes. I got a message last year from a young man named Wesley who'd found Natalie's book at his university library. He described a friendship that sounded familiar, a friend who monitored his relationships, who was always present, who couldn't accept any decision that created distance. Wesley was 23, the same age I'd been when I moved out of the apartment with Garrett. I wrote back immediately, sharing our story in detail, encouraging him to trust his instincts. He'd already done the hardest part, recognizing the pattern. The friend responded to Wesley's boundaries with escalation, just like Garrett had. But Wesley documented everything from the start, having learned from our experience. He filed for a restraining order within 3 months, before the situation could metastasize. The order was granted. His life continued without the drama that had defined my 20s, prevention rather than recovery. That's what Natalie's public exposure had accomplished. Not just justice for us, but a roadmap for others to recognize and escape similar situations before years were stolen. The hospital fundraiser gala happens every year. We don't attend anymore, having supported the cause enough through our inadvertent contribution to the event's most memorable moment. But sometimes I imagine what that night looked like to other people. The tables full of respectable community members, expecting generic inspiration and rubber chicken. Instead, they got truth delivered with precision and evidence. They got to witness justice that the legal system had initially failed to provide. They got to see that silence protects abusers while speaking out, however uncomfortable, protects everyone else. Garrett taught me that obsession disguises itself as loyalty, that control masquerades as concern, that the longest relationships aren't always the healthiest. But Natalie taught me something more important, that truth, however painful to speak, remains the only weapon against systematic manipulation. That documentation beats confrontation, that patterns, once visible, lose their power, that you can survive anything if you choose the right person to survive it with. The scar tissue remains. I still check for GPS trackers periodically, an anxiety that probably won't fade completely. I'm careful about who enters our home, who touches our computers, who knows our schedules. Hypervigilance became a permanent feature, the price of survival. But between the anxious checks and careful boundaries, we built something that couldn't be infiltrated or destroyed. A marriage based on actual choice rather than manipulation. A family that chose itself daily. A life that was finally, completely ours. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.